Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome back to AVX Live. I'm Joe Gilderson, President of Corporate Audio Visual Services. I got to tell you, we have had some pretty amazing guests in this show over the last 4 years, but today's a little different. And so I apologize in advance. I'm not sure what's going to happen, but this could be the discussion for the ages, or it could be a total flop. I'm not sure. We're going to find out, though. Before we do that, before we meet our guests, let me just remind everybody how you can find us. Facebook, LinkedIn, YouTube, Wednesdays at 1 o'clock. Any of those channels, make sure you hit the like and subscribe button. If you're watching live, this is the time to enter your comments. They will be very well received. And if you miss anything that happens today, you can go back to the YouTube channel and watch any one of the previous 122 episodes. And afterwards, we may or may not have a post on Instagram, Facebook, and LinkedIn. All right, you've been waiting for this moment. I don't have the drum roll queued up, but I do have a tambourine, but we're not going to do that. Let me tell you a little bit about our former co-host, Ryan Finch. Ryan is a director of business development for BI Worldwide. He works with large organizations to help drive results by engaging their employees, salespeople, channel partners, and customers. By applying behavioral economics to the strategy, design, and execution of custom engagement programs, Ryan and BIW help many of the Fortune 500 change the knowledge, attitudes, and behavior of the people who drive their business forward. Outside of the office, Ryan plays music with wireless mic and the analogs and enjoys time with his wife, Dana, and dog, Piper. All right, so this is it. Please welcome to the stage, Mr. Ryan Finch.
Woo! Where's the music? You got to play me on.
I'm sorry, dude. I don't have any music.
Well, you know what else I'm upset about right off the get-go is there was another part of that bio that was cut out, and I'm bothered by it.
It hit the cutting room floor, as they say.
Well, they say that's where the best pieces of a film might end up. So in this case, I get it.
I'm not sure if this was the best piece, but it was certainly high quality.
Okay. Indeed.
Now, Ryan, let me ask you, what does it feel like being on the other side of such a serious, hard-hitting program?
It's a good question. It feels like I can
lay out for this.
Yeah, it feels like I can do whatever I want and there are no consequences. That's for starters. Wow. Otherwise, I feel like, again, getting back on a bicycle, right? I've been here before. I know what to do. So if you need to, cue me up for a like, comment, share, subscribe, you just let me know.
Oh, I like this. Maybe at the end.
Maybe at the end. Okay. Yeah. Cue me in. Bring in the lefty.
A dramatic feel to get started,
Good idea.
We're very theatrical. All right. So listen, we have a real topic today. This isn't just you and I bantering back and forth. Okay.
It may look like that, but it's not.
But it's not. We have a real topic, and we're going to discuss this idea of building a culture. So I want you to tell me your thoughts of company culture and what it means to you.
That's a good question. I think culture is very emotional, right? It's sort of ubiquitous. It's sort of, you can find it showing up in a lot of different places. I think very simply, culture is kind of what happens when you're not looking, right? How are things sort of continuing on in the direction that you left it? Whether that's living the values, whether that's pursuing the company mission, understanding why you work where you work. I think all of those things come into play, but also to the extent that it's, unique, right? Like, how is one culture different than another, I think is, again, sort of hard to put your finger on at times, but the key is that it should be unique, right? It should start to influence the experience of working for that company, and something that you can kind of compare against other organizations. There's the old adage that, like, what culture eats strategy for breakfast. And that just gets back to my first point, right? It's like, what's happening when you're not pushing it, when you're not paying attention? How can you get it as like a groundswell to move in the direction that you want it?
So, I mean, first of all, you used a lot of big words. You said
I certainly did.
ubiquitous.
I just tried to confuse you. That's all.
I mean, I had to Google that while you were speaking.
Did you use AI for it? Because it could really summarize it quite well.
It did a nice job, actually. There's almost no reason for me to be hosting this program anymore. But no, but you did touch on values and mission statement. Aren't those things that just kind of live on a wall someplace in the headquarters? I mean, are those things real?
Well, unfortunately, sometimes they do just live on a wall someplace. At least, like, starting point is, let's make sure we have it, right? Like, let's make sure it exists. And this is something we'll probably talk more about in a few minutes. But the employee value proposition, right? Why do I work here, and why do I stay? Like, those are the two things I think, when you start to think about what culture is and how those values, how that mission statement on the wall translates into something tangible. Like, the first instance is, how does that impact the employee experience and why they work for your organization? And, if you think about storytelling and the value of it, you're telling the story of your company. And that's something that, we can go deep down a rabbit hole of why it's important, but it's the type of thing that, again, hopefully it's there. And then how you bring that to life is a completely separate story.
I think back to one of the big companies I worked for in the past, and right in the very beginning of the training, you had to learn the company's history. Then you had to spit it back out in a presentation. And, while you retain those things, they did not reflect anything to do with the actual culture that was going on behind the scenes.
Sure.
And it was really interesting. It was very disconnected.
Well, that's interesting. And so for you, right? Like, what is that? What do you do with that? What happens after you gave that presentation?
Well, at that point, I was in the very beginning of my role in that organization. So I didn't really notice the culture until probably 6 months in, because I was really just working hard to try to understand my role and be able to perform, right?
Right.
But then once you start seeing things that maybe don't line up, it puts some cracks in the system, so to speak,
So I'm gonna say something that's gonna make me sound smart, but this is only an illusion. Joe, you said put that on a t-shirt. You said 6 months, right? You know what's interesting about 6 months? And this is just anecdotal, but it sort of reinforces a point I'm going to make. 40% of turnover across all industries in the US happens in the first 6 months. So it's kind of interesting that was sort of your, like, it took me 6 months to just feel like I was, doing a job. And then you sort of come up for air. And that's sort of just the interesting, insight from your story. There is 40. There you go. 40% of turnover happens within the first 6 months, and that's true because it's on a slide deck for me. And there's a ton of research and much smarter people than myself. Trust me, that put these types of things in my hands. But it's also something that, again, I see sort of manifest in a lot of different places, and so that's exactly one of them. You got a story, and it didn't necessarily matter to you, and you didn't know what to make of it for the first 6 months. But then how aligned was what you were doing after that, or what the company felt like, what it felt like to work at the organization? How aligned was that?
I'll tell you what it felt like. It felt like torture, and I hated it. But that's neither here nor there.
Okay, fair. Well,
it was a terrible environment.
So they tried to do something, and it fell flat, fell short.
I think that they covered up all of their problems by saying it was a performance-driven environment. And it's very easy, I think,
to sweep things under the rug at that point.
To say, we're just trying to get the best out of you. There's a lot better ways to do it.
Well,
that's been my experience.
Performance culture is certainly, it's not the first time I've heard that, but it's kind of interesting that, like, again, that is your perception of the brand. And that influenced your perception of why you work there and what kind of organization it is. And it took you a little time to figure out, what was really going on here. And then you made your own judgment at that point.
Well, I mean, when did people really ask that question? When did they ask themselves that question? Probably in the very beginning.
Yes.
right? Hey, why would I want? You're really excited about the offer or the paycheck or maybe the facilities themselves, right? But you're sold the dream at first. And then when does someone ask themselves, why do I work here, or what? When they're unhappy. That's when they ask themselves again.
I think you're spot on. I would say happy is one component, right? So that's one, and I guess maybe I'll just expand on that, right? So if we think about engagement, ubiquitous engagement, engaged employees stay. Happiness is a part of engagement. There's an emotional component of engagement. There's commitment, there's effort, and certainly a level of inspiration and feeling attached to it. But yeah, I mean, look, you can be happy at a company, but not have your needs met in other places and still leave, right? You can be happy with the organization, but still not be getting what you need out of your work experience. So I think those things they all have to go hand in hand. Happiness is an important part of it for sure.
I think that's a good point. It's a really good point.
Thank you.
All right. So let's look at some of the other parts of the other pieces maybe that go to building a strong culture. And I'm not sure if strong is the right word, but I think you know what I'm trying to say. And
positive.
Well, my follow-up to that, a positive, productive, efficient. I don't know what the right word is, but I think that's one of those things you know it when you see it.
Yeah.
And to piggyback off that, is it just for a company, or could it be for any organization? Could it be for a club? Could it be for a sports team? Could it be for anything? Or is it just a company?
Oh, that's a great question. I think the short answer is once you get more than 3 people, right? 3 is a crowd. I think you're entering into a dynamic.
I think they have another name for that, actually.
This is a family program. This is a family program, and I don't speak French. But I think when you get to, you like that one, that was good. When you get to a place where you have more than, 2 people, you start to enter into a conversation about this is now a living, breathing dynamic. And I think that's when culture begins. I think that's when you're having to kind of consider what that dynamic is. Certainly the smaller that number, the more heavily influenced by one person it is. And so in some ways, the smaller organizations have a harder job, harder in some ways, easier in others, than the global behemoths, the 300,000, employee organizations. But again, it's like you're looking at one person being outsized in terms of the impact that they have on that dynamic. And so when you think about like a sports team, and this is very top of mind because my Rangers sucked this year, my New York Rangers, and hopefully they're not watching. But if you are, I believe in you. You can do better next year. And they canned their coach. And I just thought that was sort of an interesting, segue into this point, is that I think leadership and management are going to be kind of your first. They're going to drive culture, especially in the smaller organizations, in a much more outsized way than larger organizations, because then you have more personalities, right? When you're in an organization of 300,000, you may work for an org unit that has, 200, 300 people. And then now you have a leader, and their leader's personality influences, let's go Knicks, attaboy. Their leaders influence, their personality. You take on the personality of your leader. And so then culture starts to be like a collection of personalities. And how do we create cohesion across all of these, if you want to call them silos, but how do we create cohesion at scale? So to answer your question, yeah, I mean, I think there's nuanced differences to smaller organizations, but they're certainly there. The culture is certainly a component of that. And then as far as what those building blocks are, I touched on leadership, right? Like that's an obvious one.
Okay.
Their personality, obvious. That mission, vision, values thing that's on the door, maybe, somewhere or buried, or hopefully it exists at the very least, and how that translates into an employee value proposition. And ultimately, again, thinking about the pieces, the building blocks, is what are the other areas in, the employee experience where those things come to life? And so, to give you an example, like as we look at culture and employee value proposition, especially as a new hire, as you're experiencing that for the first time. We think that starts prior to starting. It's before your first day, right? It's like, how are you bringing this to life before they even get there? How are you setting them up for component number 2, which is a great first day, an active first day? Sometimes people don't have their computers, they don't have their equipment, they're not ready to start. But how do you keep it active?
Very true.
And so there's a lot of correlation around having a great first day and having a good overall perception of your employee experience. And then as you translate to what are those things that make up an everyday employee experience, the average day for an employee? What are those things that, again, bring those components to life, that employee value proposition, and the other, sort of facets of engagement, and then achievements, right? How are we highlighting achievements? How are we celebrating, growth and development? And then how are we encouraging people to bring more people on? Joe, this is something you could probably talk a lot about, which is it's interesting when you have an organization that their friends start to come with them. And, Zach might bring a Ryan, and Ryan might bring a Johnny Clark, and Johnny Clark might bring a Dean. And how do you get more of that? Because that is incredibly valuable, as I'm sure you would agree, to every organization. But depending on the Zach at the beginning, and I'm giving him a lot of credit because he's watching. But depending on,
I'm going to bring him up every time you mention his name. It's like a drinking game.
If would you be likely to recommend a friend or colleague work at that organization that you started to feel like 6 months in was like, this place kind of sucks? Probably not.
No,
probably not. So to the extent
I will even do better than that, Ryan. Yeah. I told the guy who was going to replace me not to take the job and that he was a fool and he shouldn't take it.
There you go. The organizations spend a ton of money on recruitment and hiring. And so you can either make that really easy for them or make that really hard for them. So those are just those little areas where, again, we're probably going to talk about business impact, but like these are components that matter to the culture, but also matter to the organization in unique ways.
All right. I have a number of things I want to touch off of that. Let me just go to some of the comments here. Somehow someone has hijacked our LinkedIn account, but it says nice to see Ryan back on the screen. And it made some sort of derogatory comment about me.
I love that.
Our friend Jeff Cabelli, he's happy to watch us having a good time. Isn't that nice?
I am having a good time.
See, now let me see. And then of course we brought Zach up several times because, by the way, the Knicks are totally going to lose to Detroit. That makes me even happier.
That's not nice.
I'm sorry. That's something else.
You got to believe.
All right. Let's see. Here's another comment from our hijacked LinkedIn account. As a great culture because of the buy-in from everyone. Well, I think that goes back to the point that you were talking about, that it can't just be one person.
Right.
It can't just be, the leader of that group, but that they're highly affected. And then the world revolves around me. Do you miss me?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Now that we've addressed that question, let's go back to it. You mentioned the Rangers, just as an example. The most common, scapegoat of every sports team is always the coach.
It's easy.
Which I think is, and in recent cases, at least in the basketball side, it's been the general manager and the coach.
Yeah.
Which is really unique because that is kind of like your culture. Those are your two big people that are theoretically driving that culture, right?
Yes.
And if you heard anything, I don't know if you follow anything on the Denver Nuggets, they got rid of their general manager. They got rid of their head coach who just won a championship a couple of years ago. They have arguably the best player on the planet that plays in their team. And they had a really good record. They're like the fourth best team, but they fired everybody. They literally went through and cleared house. What do you think that means that culture was like? I mean, how bad must it have been to the day before going to the playoffs, they're firing everybody?
So I think that speaks really well to the fact that it is very emotional, that culture isn't something that is purely rational and, objective on paper. And so unfortunately, an answer to what to do about that could be start over. And if you think about where the more you have to take a much more nuanced approach to fixing an emotional problem when you're keeping all the same people in the same places than when you're going to just kind of clean house. And I think that's why you see a lot of, and again, I'm not a sports analyst, but my guess is that's probably what the easier option is. There is, we could be a contender next year, or we could be trying to chase our tail on an emotional problem that's pervasive, that kind of sticky, that sticks around. It speaks to the value of culture and the importance of it, but also to why, the emotional nature of it can be kind of hard to pin down, and why it's important to understand how to influence it.
Well, I think there's also that factor that it's easier to get rid of one person than the entire team, right? Because that doesn't make any sense either. And of course, each group, the Rangers, will probably maintain 80% of their team, but they'll bring in one person, two new staff, whatever the new regime of management is going to be.
There's also,
I think that's why.
There's an interesting relationship to again, you think about culture, you think about engagement, right? And then you think about performance. And if you think of those being kind of like a triangle, those things are related. And when the results are there, the other problems kind of start to work out, and it's a cyclical nature between the two. So then when the results are not there, you start to lose the culture. You then get people who are not trying as hard as they could because they're a little bit checked out, which means the results get worse, which means now your wheels are rolling backwards instead of forwards. And so, you can end up with a problem starting in any three of those areas. Maybe you got a cultural issue, maybe you have an engagement problem, or maybe just, market conditions. The other teams are better. That's possible. The problem is that can spin out of control.
No, it's all true. As sports, I think, just become an easy way to analyze something that happens in an organization.
Joe, it's a microcosm.
That's ubiquitous.
It's a ubiquitous microcosm. It is a ubiquitous microcosm.
Look, we got some comments. Jeff's got to run. He must have real work to do, but he said it's good info for all leadership. Of course, our friend Peter Malone, I think, is directing a comment to our friend Zach. And that I think he's referring to the Knicks trying to run a business. And I have to read this comment before I put it up because it could be dicey, but
smart.
Okay. Actually, this plays in. You had mentioned, let's go back to my, you said leadership, mission, values, and we talked about the relationships between, I kind of summarized it to be departments. But the other sorry, wrong button. The other comment I have here is, doesn't the buck stop ultimately with the owner on a sports team or in a business? Which is a great question reflecting our current political system, because it's clearly not someone's responsibility, but we're going to keep moving beyond it. But I think these kind of play together. So does the buck stop ultimately? I mean, I think it has to.
I want to touch on something there, because this is something you've heard me say before. And
was I listening?
No, and I know the answer. I know the answer to that. Trust me. But maybe you just disagreed. But in any case, the concept of the buck stopping, it implies ownership. The leader, the manager, own a result. But to what extent does the employee own the same result? In some case, for sales, that tends to be a little more direct and easy to measure. But for other people where they have discretionary effort, where, all right, I know you're telling me to do this, I'm doing a pretty good job, I don't necessarily need to do it that way, I could probably still keep my job, right? To what extent can you get them to take ownership and to be accountable for something you want them to do? And that is sort of again, another nuanced area of business, but why, the premise of culture matters, and why influencing results sometimes is about influencing that groundswell. And it's about getting people to buy in, to be committed, to own some sort of, whether it's initiative or a work result or a quality result or whatever it might be. But that premise of ownership is really important, because sometimes organizations will put a lot of effort into trying to inspire commitment and ownership on some component, some facet. And I'll give you an example. We literally just had another webinar that finished right before I got onto this one, where I think I'm allowed to say it because it was a public webinar, but Medtronic had an initiative. And in this case, they were trying to get people to take ownership of their free cash flow problem. And you can imagine, if I'm working in a plant somewhere, that's not my problem. It doesn't necessarily connect to me until the organization helps connect the dots on why it matters to this person and what they can do about it in a way that gets them to commit and to take action against it. So again, on the topic of leaders versus employees and buck stopping, I think it's important to kind of extend the dots there, that ownership can apply to employees as well.
100%. I mean, that's usually when you have the best team, is when each person feels ownership for their responsibility or their role.
Feels. And I think that's the operative word there. It's emotional. It's hard to pin down.
Right. You could say, yeah, that's so-and-so, that may be that group people over there, but ultimately I'm the one who's in charge of this area, and I want to do the best job I can.
Right.
That's where you're trying to get to.
Yes. Yeah.
That is the promised land,
That is the promised land. Absolutely. And it's elusive at times.
100%. And, I know that's what we're always trying to work on. And, we joke around about having a company where people never really leave. We had our 40th anniversary party. There were probably, a dozen past employees at minimum, some from very long ago, and really kind of everybody's interconnected. They're still friends. This one went to someone else's wedding. They're very involved. They're playing music together. There's a lot of kind of different ways of engaging with the other people. What do you think of this concept? I mean, does that really exist? Does a company where people never really leave exist?
I think, as evidenced by me being on this program today, I might even turn that question around to you. I have some thoughts on it, but I'm curious what you think about an organization where people never really leave. Because I think a lot of people in at least our local marketplace would say corporate AV does a pretty good job. They tend to have a lot of people who really stick around and want to be there. And what do you think?
I think I'm the host and I'm asking the questions.
Okay. Well, I do have an answer. I was just giving you the time in the sun, but fine.
Look, I think it takes a long time to build that kind of, I think you're building a relationship with your environment, with your clients, you're touching every element.
Yeah.
With your staff, and everything's got to work together. And if you're a jerk to your suppliers, you're probably going to be a jerk to somebody else. And at some point that's going to mean you're a jerk to, your staff. And I think it's just all got to work together. If you take it as in our case, we kind of look at everything as a long-term relationship.
Right.
And that makes decisions easier, because if you're in a public company and you're looking at a quarterly result, especially when the stock market's up and down, there's kind of different stressors that are happening. And you have to report to these people. I mean, it's the reality. You have to report to shareholders, and you have to show that you're making progress. And, a private company, certainly one that's smaller, doesn't have that kind of stress. It has different problems, so to speak.
Yeah.
But I think in our case, it's the idea and the concept of being a part of a community, of doing our, best work, and always, striving for that best work. The idea of continuous improvement always plays into that, because it means you can't settle for where you are. And so I think I've always tried to tie the performance in with the environment. And, sometimes that works, sometimes it doesn't work. And if it doesn't work, it's how can you move on in a positive manner for both? because it doesn't always work.
Right. Right. I think it's sort of what I expected you to say. I've come to experience your ideology on exactly this. I have some sort of new perspective, not just from working now at a larger, 1,000+ people organization, but also
Ubiquitous.
We have there's like 14, 15, I don't know, they kind of lose count, different business units that all sort of specialize in different things at BIW. And one of them is a research and strategy team. And so that group will go and actually survey the literal millions of people that we're touching in some form or another in the course of a year, and just starting to build up a picture of what the drivers are of things that we've been talking about, right? Like the reason why people stay, they're committed to an organization. One thing that's not on there, and then I'll talk to the stuff that is thinking about, again, what's happening before the hiring process starts to contribute to that. You talk a lot about fit, having a fit for the organization. Especially when the companies get larger, you have to think of fit differently, where fit is not just about, are you a fit for the culture, right, at the organizational level, but are you a fit for the role? Certainly that ends up being the first criteria. And are you a fit for the people that you're going to be experiencing on a day-to-day basis? And so again, for a bigger company, that's not all the same people, and it doesn't go as perfectly hand in hand. But to the extent that you can be, specific about that, I think that you tend to take a very fit-based hiring approach, which I would say means that you probably have more people coming on that are that type of people to resonate with the culture that's there and to fit inside of it, as opposed to a big personality coming in and changing the dynamic. So I think for starters, that is my sort of thought process, having experienced it and now sort of applying things that I've come to learn. But
you're applying science to art, man.
Science and art. I mean, this is the intersection of that. We
are artists here.
We are art. I mean, I'm an artist. I'm an artist.
So I've heard.
I haven't done a lot of artwork lately. But
I I haven't seen a piece recently, but
moving on. So I lost my, no, I have my train of thought. I'm back on adult brain.
So easy.
So easy and tasteful. And so I would say that there are, as part of that research and strategy team, so there is actually a research report that we do every year, where the things that we see as most ubiquitous in the people who would fit the description of what you're saying, the people who stick around, would say that their organizations touch on a few things. And I can put this research report in the comments if people like. Hi, Jim. One of, or maybe a couple that I'll pick out that I personally connect back to my experience at Corporate AV is number one. The first thing on that list is making it personal. I think it's very easy, especially for large organizations, to lose the personal aspect of work. You spend, 2/3 of your life, of your day, with a group of people, and it's silly, at least in modern view, to leave your whole self out of it. And so to be able to make a personal relationship, which can at times make it more difficult to make objective decisions, which you have to in business, as you well know, but the benefits outweigh the positives, right? Or the benefits outweigh the negatives when it comes to making it personal. Certainly from a belonging sense, don't use big words, you confuse him. Wow.
We all know that.
Yeah.
That's ubiquitous.
That's ubiquitous. That's good. Well, hey, there you go. Yeah, I mean, look, I can talk all day on this, but if there's one other thing that I want to, or maybe two other things I want to tie back. Number one is giving it meaning, right? Giving it meaning, which everybody's going to bring their own sense of meaning and purpose to the workplace. We're not all saving lives, literally. Like, we're not all saving lives. And so it's not about, I wake up every day because I'm so incredibly, this is the only thing that matters to me. That's not it. It's your reason is your personal reason. But to the extent that you, as a business owner, are able to influence my reason, it may only be one small part of my reason, but you do get a say, you do get a vote. You do get to influence that. And so when organizations are very tactful and purposeful about that, if somebody's on the fence and you've given them a story and that story resonates with their story, you've created a connection. And if you haven't given them the story, they're going to come up with their own. Right. And then the last one I'll put out there is to be able to see their future. Nobody likes the feeling of being in a job that is dead end. And I can say personally, I never felt that way. It was never a feeling of, I don't know where this goes. And I think that's something that you as a leader do quite well. That's a question for everybody to ask is, am I laying out career pathways in a way that makes sense? Am I showing people what maybe unconventional paths other people have taken? Like if I don't see necessarily the obvious next step for me, maybe that needs to be clarified. And if it's clarified, then now it feels like I'm working towards something. If I'm not working towards anything, then the question of what am I doing? What am I doing with my life? Where are we? If you don't give them that story and they don't see that path, again, they're going to fill in the blanks and you may not like where it goes. And so these are, again, a couple of the things that I would pull out, even going back to the giving it meaning, like as the course of business takes place, we can remember during COVID 2020, the save the ship. I mean, that was a rallying cry, but that was meaning, that was purpose. There was a reason why we were working 16-hour days. And yeah, it's not always like that, but a little bit of that is always happening. And so I think that's just sort of a good example.
Well, before we go into, I have some other questions on the research side of it.
Yeah.
So that save that ship mantra did not come from the formal leader. It came from
Absolutely.
another person within the organization who is an informal leader.
Right.
Because leadership's not about a position.
Absolutely.
It's about how you can influence others.
Absolutely.
And in his case, that I like to think that it can go all directions. It can go up, it can go down, it can go sideways. I think that's when you really have people working together for a common goal.
100%. Joe, what if that isn't a perfect manifestation of culture, then what is? Because if that individual said abandon ship and that became the rallying cry, that would have been bad. That would have been bad news bears.
Rats.
The script.
Yeah. Scurvy, rats. I mean, it's not a pretty picture.
Right.
It's not good.
But it's not like you told him to do that. You didn't say, hey, I need you to come up with something good, make it sticky. You didn't. No, he did that himself because he was bought in. He was part of the mission.
Yeah, he's pretty good. He's like one big soundbite. I mean, he's good. He's made for TV.
Fair.
Of course, that comes back to knowing individually. What you mentioned, making it personal.
Yeah.
One of the things that way back I had a manager who I really enjoyed working for. A lot of people did not like this person. He was so entertaining, though. I mean, he was really. I considered him like the character Bluto from Popeye.
Yeah.
I mean, he was blustery. He was, smoking away illegally in a place he wasn't supposed to be doing that. He was like a cartoon character. However, I learned a lot from him in the terms of leadership. Not so much in culture, but I think it transitioned to that down the road. But one of the things that I certainly took from him is I watched how there was probably 100 people in the location, but he looked at it as he had just 5 or 6 employees because those were his managers. The managers then handled their team, and that's how the organization was run. I watched how he treated each of his managers extremely different. And the conversations they were having were very different. When he spoke to one person who was in charge of production, they never spoke about work. They spoke about sports, the stock market, current news. They never spoke about the actual work because the work was done. It was being done properly. He had a good team in place. It was good, rock solid. When he spoke to, in that case, it was like his finance and office department. It was very much like a servant style of leadership. What can I get for you? What do you need? And it was really interesting, the dynamics. When he spoke to another department that was definitely more lax in comparison, it was like beat down city. I mean, he was tearing them apart, trying to light a fire to get them motivated.
Right.
And it was really interesting. And then on my side, it was much more like educational. Because I asked him one day, I'm like, I got to know, what's the deal with how you treat everyone so differently? He goes, well, first of all, you're the only one who's ever asked me. He says, I do that because each individual has different needs, has
Right.
different strengths,
Right.
and, you know, has kind of different things you're trying to engage with. I guess we're using the culture
Yeah,
analogy.
absolutely.
He said, look, there's rules, there's parameters, you know, you have a handbook, all of those things. Those are kind of like the guidelines to work within. But that's not how you're really going to get the most out of people. He said, you really have to make it personal, as you had said. And I honestly, I learned a lot from him.
Hmm.
While I really did not like the company at all, I did enjoy working for him, and I learned a lot from him. And it made me work hard for a group I didn't really believe in. So that went to the individual.
That's an interesting insight. Look, I mean, if every organization could have 1,000 of those types of leaders and managers, then I'd probably be out of a job. There would be no reason for business. And not to say it's all just an underperformance issue, but that's really valuable because it outkicks the coverage of, results, of buy-in to the product or the company mission, which, all right, maybe it's not a big detractor. Maybe it's not enough to push you out the door, but it's not the reason you get out of bed in the morning. And, I just think that's not to underplay the fact that the personal connection with managers and leaders is incredibly important. So anyway, that's good insight.
It was interesting because the person afterwards was terrible, and I left about 2 months later. Okay, so let's go to tell me about behavioral economics.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
So does culture have an influence or an impact financially? Positive, negative? I mean, how does all that work?
Sure. I'll split that into two pieces because the answer is yes. Culture impacts business results, and behavioral economics can be an interesting or a helpful ideology to how to impact culture and business results. So behavioral economics, put very simply, is the science behind why people do the things that they do. And if you could boil that down to one simple premise, you've heard me say it a few times, it's that people are overwhelmingly emotional in the decisions that they make. Even me knowing that, still making emotional decisions, it's just one of those things that comes with the human experience. And so organizations that know how to take advantage of that, not in a negative, maniacal way, but just know how to take advantage of that as a change agent, to be a change agent, are successful in influencing culture and influencing those business outcomes. And so I got to say, this is one that I find really fascinating, is the behavioral economics part. There's a book that has become sort of I don't want to say Bible so close to Easter because it's a bit sacrilegious, but a foundational sort of framework of understanding for how people think. And it's called Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman. That's something we talk about here at BIW, but I had that book in my bedroom in White Plains when I lived with Zach and Dormy, as you can remember. So that was many years ago. So there's what?
Well, you mentioned Zach, so I have to bring him back up.
You do have to bring it back up, yeah. So it's just something that sort of resonated. I find it really interesting, all the places that manifests. Again, it is very much an emotional and understanding the human condition, and how that plays itself out in the marketplace. And so then when we think about culture and business outcomes, certainly very interrelated, and being able to apply that understanding of behavioral economics into programs that drive engagement along a variety of initiatives, whether it is general reinforcement of cultural values to create a more palpable and a more distinct, there we go, a more ubiquitous culture. Whether it's geared towards that, we just want them more engaged in the culture itself to make it more cohesive, or we're trying to drive engagement on a specific initiative, whether that's to improve our free cash cash flow position, or to improve safety, or to improve quality, quality in production, or to improve customer satisfaction scores. So there's a variety of places where behavioral economics can help you nudge people at scale to make an impact in the places that matter to the business. I think broadly speaking, when we think about pairing engagement and results, you can think of engagement drives retention. So people are less likely to leave when they're engaged. And that can mean different things depending on what role you're in, but engagement broadly will help combat organizations that are suffering from high rates of turnover, for example. Certainly, quality and productivity. There was a really good, and I'll see if I can pull it. I can put it in the comments. It was a research report showcasing over, I don't say how many years, but basically pairing the survey scores of people who work at organizations across the map and putting the organizations where there's a high level of engagement and positive sentiment, so feeling, putting them in an ETF and trading that against the S&P 500, and it outperforms the S&P 500 for years on end and consistently across the board every time. So what that means is, Joe, you might remember this from your MBA days, but the service profit chain. We familiar with the service profit chain? Wow. Happy employees create happy customers equals profit. It sounds so simple, and it is, and it still works. Happy people treat your customers better, make them happier, and ultimately happy customers bring revenue to the business. So that it's not surprising. It's an interesting correlation. It's not surprising. And you can kind of parse it a number of different ways. Is it because what we were doing influenced the engagement, which influenced the results? The answer is yes. Is it because we had a great culture and that influenced engagement and that influenced results? Also, yes. So the idea is that all these things sort of work hand in hand, and depending on where the organization is in that life cycle, they may choose to focus on one place or another, but they go hand in hand. So does that, I know that's a lot. Does that answer your question?
It's ubiquitous.
It's ubiquitous.
It's palpable and ubiquitous.
Palpable, ubiquitous. What was the other one I had? I had another word.
I don't know.
Put that on a shirt. No.
Tasteful?
No, that's not it.
Your vocabulary is a little better than mine. So.
I've always had a good vocabulary. And
it's
that's
more better.
No.
Well, we'll stick to English today.
See.
I think, having some facts and numbers behind something that is so emotional and personal, I think really lends a lot to the ideas. Because I think a good environment when you're there. And sometimes it's just a good department if it's a big organization.
Absolutely. Right.
And so maybe that is more driven by a leader or philosophy, or, in a large organization, you have those, you have silos, you have departments, you may have different business units. It is much more complex.
It is. And case in point, right? Like talking about what to do about it. If you could get all of your leaders and managers across all these silos to at least just do the things that the best ones do, right? If you could at least just all right, you're not going to be able to get a carbon copy of Joe Gilderson 1,000 times, but what are the things that Joe does? What does he do? And how can we make that something to kind of rally around for the other people who aren't Joe? Like, hey, you may not be Joe, but if you just did this a little bit more often, you would see a measurable difference in the business. And especially as the numbers get bigger for the people leaders. And that's kind of another area that's fascinating to me, is how they can take data and make legitimate business cases around doing things, making investment in certain areas. And maybe it is a manager training program. Maybe it's a communications program. Maybe it's some sort of recognition program where we're trying to inspire the next crop of Joes inside the organization. And we're focusing around the things that Joe does really well. And so that's it. It's not rocket science, it's behavioral science. And that's mine. TM. Put that one, that one's me. But you do have to kind of.
Do I have to write that? Do I have to write that now?
You can. It's not rocket science, it's behavioral science. Ryan Finch, 2025. If you want to put the date, it's April 23rd, 1:49 p.m. See if that'll all fit.
Okay.
Letters get small.
I can't read this, but I think this about sums it up.
It's not rocket science. I mean, there's a missing apostrophe in 2 places, but that's okay. It's not rocket science. It's behavioral science. JG. Oh, you took credit, you bastard. Well, look, as long as the message gets out there, I think that's good.
Well, the message is good. You know, I'm trying to, this brings to a very important, almost ending here, that I'm trying to influence and create a culture for 2 almost Joes at home. And one of them is not a Joe, but she's a Marissa, and it's her birthday. So happy birthday, Marissa.
Wow.
She's
Happy
15 today, and
Do you know what
she
that is?
is amazing.
Happy birthday, Marissa. Happy birthday. That, Joe, is a perfect example of behavioral science at work because you provided some recognition, which is actually a good thing when you're
Wow.
trying to get people to do more of the things that you want them to do, is you recognize that. So have more birthdays, Marissa. That's what we're hearing. No, but you're
Come on.
creating visibility. And again, in terms of where we leave this off, that's a really good way to start about what you get more of is what you recognize.
Well, so we're going to summarize. Can you really create a culture where people never really leave?
Yes. Clearly.
You can.
You can indeed. Yes, Ryan Finch, 2025.
Yes, Ryan Finch. Here we go. And yes. Okay, and bingo and bango. Bob's your uncle.
Boom. Bob,
There you go.
Robert. He goes by
Well,
Robert.
Ryan, we're going to keep you on. Hold on. There might be a few more. Let me make sure I got a few comments here. Well, most importantly, yes, Marissa is amazing. So
Yeah.
she generates most of the comments.
That's good.
Michael J. Dardano says, good job, gentlemen. Something about cultured
Everyone
yogurt.
eat some cultured yogurt.
I'm not sure what he's talking about. And I think those are all our comments today. I think we've had an engaged group.
We've had engagement. That's nice.
Yeah, I think that's really important. So, Ryan, we're going to try to see if you can remember any of this because we're going to wrap this up today. It's been an excellent discussion about culture and how you can do something about it too, not just let it happen to you, but how you can be involved. And by getting everyone engaged and, having a lot of different factors, you got to go back and watch the show. I'm not going to summarize it for you because I'll be doing your work. And then that would not be a culture of performance and high intensity. All right.
Oh boy.
I don't know. I had nothing to go on right there. All right, Finch, listen, we're going to wrap it up. So why don't you tell people how they can find us?
Here goes. You can find us on Facebook, on LinkedIn, on YouTube Live. You can do that every Wednesday at 1 p.m. And while you're there, you should drop us a comment, be part of the show. Drop your questions here and we'll answer them live. Don't forget to like, comment, share, subscribe, all the above. And if you missed this episode, don't worry. You will see our full discography on YouTube, as well as little bite-sized pieces, shark bites, like our friend Andrew Castellano at Shark Creative says, on Instagram, on Facebook, and on LinkedIn, if Alexis can ever get around to it.
You can't insult her.
I did. Right. Well, she's a friend of mine, so I can say that. And if she has a problem with it, she knows how to reach me.
Actually, I'm not sure that she does, but
she does. We text sometimes.
Oh, all right. This is fantastic news. I love it. I like creating that kind of environment where people continue to engage with each other when they're not currently working together.
Look at that. Nice. Well played.
All right, Finch. I'm going to give you one shot at an outro to say something before I make it go away.
Sayonara, suckers.
All right. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Bye-bye. Ciao.